She stood in the freezing dawn, wrists torn raw, belly heavy with child, tied to a fence post like an animal, abandoned to the coyotes. No one spoke for her. No one came, until a stranger on horseback stopped and drew a knife. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The night air bit through the thin cotton of Lillian's traveling coat, each gust carving deeper into her bones. Her dress, once neatly pressed for the hopeful meeting she'd imagined, now clung in rumpled damp patches to her legs. Dust had settled in the folds of her skirt, in the creases of her elbows, in the corners of her eyes where tears had dried too fast. Around her, the desert stretched flat and merciless, the color of ash beneath a sky full of cold stars. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried, a high, sorrowful sound that matched the hollow ache growing in her chest. She flexed her fingers against the rope, not to free herself but to feel something, anything, besides numbness. Her wrists burned where the fibers had scraped skin raw. Every movement sent sparks of pain down her forearms, but she welcomed it. Pain meant she was still present, still real, still standing. Her lower back throbbed under the weight of her pregnancy, a slow, pulsing ache that reminded her just how vulnerable she had become. But she refused to sag, refused to let her knees buckle. They might have left her like an animal, discarded, nameless, condemned, but she would not give them the dignity of collapse. She thought of the letter again, the one that began with, "Dear Miss Monroe," and ended with, "I hope we can begin anew together." The handwriting had been careful, the ink slightly smudged in places, as if the man had paused to choose his words. It had smelled faintly of tobacco and pine. She had tucked it into her bodice for the journey and touched it often, drawing courage from its promise. Now, that promise rang hollow. Now, she wondered whether the man had ever written it at all. They had seen the bump beneath her coat and turned to stone. No questions, no kindness, only the word spoiled hurled at her like spit. But what did they know of her fiancé? Of Thomas's gentle hands or the way he whispered poems to her belly at night? What did they know of the cave-in, of the way she clawed at the rocks until her nails split, screaming his name through choking dust? They saw a burden. She carried a life. A breeze stirred the dust at her feet. She leaned her forehead gently against the fence post, its splintered wood rough against her skin, and whispered low enough that only her unborn child could hear. "This isn't how we end. This is just where we begin." The first light of morning crept across the plains like a hesitant promise, turning the edges of dry scrub and brittle grass to gold. Elijah Boone had no cause to ride that early. No cows gone missing, no storm coming. But something had gnawed at him all night, pulling his thoughts toward the old trade road like a hook under his ribs. He'd saddled his mare at dawn, said nothing to the wind, and let the trail lead him. His horse slowed before he told it to, ears twitching at the scent of something wrong. Elijah saw the figure tied to the fence before he even registered she was a woman. From a distance, she might have been mistaken for a rag bundle left behind by a drunk. But as he neared, the truth hit him harder than any blow. A woman, bound like livestock, standing in stiff, defiant silence with her belly round beneath a filthy dress. He dismounted with the same quiet efficiency he used to mend fences or tend sick calves. No dramatics, no exclamations. Just a man who understood how to act when something was broken. The blade of his knife flashed once, clean and sharp, before the rope fell away in two ragged halves. Up close, she was younger than he first thought, mid-20s maybe. But there was a tiredness in her eyes that didn't belong to youth. Her wrists were raw, her lips cracked, but she didn't flinch when he approached. She didn't weep or plead. She looked him square in the eye and asked for help like a woman who'd already decided the world would give her nothing she didn't demand with her own breath. He nodded once. She swayed slightly as the rope fell, catching herself on the fence, one arm cradling her belly. He reached for her gently, letting her see his intent, then lifted her into the saddle as though she weighed no more than a sack of flour, though they both knew she carried more than that. They set off without a word, her hands gripping the pommel, his boots crunching in the dust beside her. The mare moved slow, as if sensing her precious cargo. The wind stirred only now and then, offering no conversation. But Elijah didn't mind the silence. He'd long preferred it to words that meant nothing. And still, as they walked beneath a sky thick with the last of the night stars, something quiet passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but something older than language. A mutual understanding, a shared truth, that the world was cruel, but sometimes mercy came with calloused hands and no explanation at all. The days unfolded slowly at Elijah Boone's homestead, not from idleness, but from the kind of rhythm born where time was measured not by clocks, but by the rise of dough, the mending of seams, and the shift of sunlight across hand-hewn floorboards. Lillian found herself easing into that rhythm without realizing it. Each morning she woke before the rooster's crow, washed her face in cold water from the basin, and tied her apron over the one dress that still held its shape. There was always something to do. Shirts with missing buttons, flour sacks to repurpose, and apples to peel even if half were already soft with age. The house itself was a quiet testament to Elijah's life. It was built not with elegance but with integrity, thick beams, sturdy corners, and no space wasted. The wood smelled of old pine and wind, and the walls bore the scent of coffee, dust, and tobacco, comforts of a man who kept to himself. There were no decorations, no photographs, but everything had been cared for. And now, with the scent of her pies drifting from the kitchen and the faint scrape of her sewing needle in the evenings, it was changing. Not louder, just warmer. Lillian spoke little, not out of coldness, but because she'd spent too many months learning silence for survival. Words had been used against her, twisted, doubted, dismissed. Here, she didn't need to explain herself. Elijah didn't fill the air with questions. He simply passed her the hammer when she reached for it, left the last biscuit without comment, and mended his fence while she pressed apples into crusts beside an open window. But in that hush, trust was beginning to take shape, stitched slowly like the baby blanket she worked on in the afternoons, using worn pieces of her past life. The hem of her Sunday dress, the sash from her engagement apron. Her hands moved with purpose, but her breath sometimes caught in her chest when she touched a certain fabric too long. One evening, exhaustion claimed her before the final stitch. Elijah found her slumped at the table, the candle burned down to a stub. He didn't wake her, just fetched the old patchwork quilt from his cot, faded but soft, and laid it gently across her shoulders. Then he sat across from her, elbows on knees, eyes fixed on the woman who had somehow brought life into his quiet world, simply by breathing inside it. The next morning, when he offered her a place to stay, she hesitated, not because she doubted him, but because she still doubted her worth. And when he spoke of burdens, of what she carried, she looked at him for a long moment, then wept, not because she was weak, but because for the first time she knew someone saw her strength. The church bell rang slow that morning, not because there was a wedding scheduled, but because Elijah Boone had asked for it. The townsfolk came out in small clusters, buttoning jackets, brushing crumbs from collars, whispering guesses behind gloved hands. It wasn't often a man like Boone, who spoke less than most men prayed, made a public request. And it wasn't often a wedding took place without weeks of notice, cake orders, or fuss. Lillian walked beside him with her chin high, though her heart beat hard enough to echo in her ears. Her dress was plain muslin, hand-stitched, every seam pressed with quiet care. The ribbon in her hair was faded blue, the last keepsake of her mother's kitchen apron. She had no veil, no bouquet, no trousseau. But she carried something heavier than all of those things combined. Every shameful glance, every whisper from the dry goods store, every cruel phrase she'd swallowed since her boots first stepped into Copper Creek. And she walked with all of it, not as a burden, but as a truth she no longer needed to hide. Inside the church, the preacher stood a little straighter when he saw them approach. The congregation hushed. No one giggled or coughed. Not when Elijah Boone, tall and weathered in his best wool vest, took her hand before the altar. When asked if he came to take this woman as his wife, Elijah didn't pause, didn't glance toward the pews or the back doors where the gossips stood waiting for some scandal. He said, "Because no one should ever be left tied to a post, and because I see her, all of her." There was no need for more. Afterward, there was no reception, no music, no clinking glasses. Just the creak of a wagon, the hush of dust under wheels, and the soft sound of fabric swaying as Lillian stepped into the home they now shared not as guest and host, but as two people bound by choice, not pity. That night, with her hands steady, she laid the baby blanket inside the pine crib Elijah had carved from the cedar at the edge of his land. Her voice, soft and full, reached into the quiet. "We're not just safe, we're seen." And across town, the old fence post still stood, but now it bore a birdhouse nailed up by Elijah with care. Beneath it, roses had begun to grow, roots winding deep in the soil where her tears once fell. No one ever used it for cruelty again. It became a marker, not of shame, but of mercy. And in time, even Copper Creek learned to look twice at a woman's burdens and then see past them.